Now, turn off all the lights and get ready to never sleep again. Part 1. I'm a security guard in an old mental hospital. I found something in the basement tunnels. By Jgrupe. For around 2 years now, I've worked as a low-rent security guard at St. Daniel's mental health facility in our town. It's classified as medium/high level security and contains forensic units where patients are held who have committed crimes of some sort and been declared innocent by reason of insanity. I don't get many details about the history or crimes of the patients, except from nurses who will mention something in passing. In the lull after a code white or in the cafeteria, someone would let something slip. Like how the one who acts like a dog and howls, drinks from toilets during full moons, he killed his little sister and her friends. Or, watch out for that one, he's unpredictable. He's in here for strangling someone on the city bus, and we're pretty sure he's bringing in crack from the outside and selling it. I'd pick up all kinds of tidbits. I was on a first-name basis and had a friendly rapport built up with one patient named Sam, until a nurse let it slip that he was a child molester. A serial child molester. I couldn't look him in the eye after hearing that, although I never knew for sure if it was actually true. He was a small, chubby toad of a man, with a goofy smile and Kermit the Frog voice. I thought he looked harmless enough until I pictured him standing over a child in a dark back room somewhere, or luring little ones at the mall with promises of puppies, video games, and candy. Despite all that, most of the patients in the facility were actually pretty pleasant. I tell people all the time that a lot of people in these places get a bad rep, but they're actually decent enough people. Hardly anyone was violent, especially when they were properly medicated. Code whites, violent patients, would happen maybe once or twice a shift, but it was usually manageable enough, and within a few minutes I would go back to being bored again. Maybe I had just gotten used to the place. Although the staff and most of the patients were amiable enough, the actual hospital, the grounds themselves, were really creepy. The hospital was first constructed over 150 years before, and although it had been rebuilt piecemeal over time, many parts of the various buildings on the grounds were ancient. The basement of the main building, for example, had sections which were never refinished or renovated. Tunnels 2 and 3 times the length of football fields crossed beneath the buildings for vast stretches. You would be walking along at night through the old mildew-smelling basement and would hear footsteps coming toward you for a long, long time before actually seeing the person who was coming, due to the slanting walls or corners obstructing the view. When the smiling, anxious face of another staff member came around the corner to greet you, it was a relief, especially at night, when there was hardly ever anyone in the basement. Code yellows, missing patients, were so common they didn't even bother calling them on the overhead PA anymore. We would usually get a list of 5 to 10 patients each night who had gone out on privileges and never came back, just hopped on a bus and left or wandered off into the neighborhood across the street. Absconded was the official term we used. This made patrolling the hospital grounds at night even scarier, knowing an escaped mental patient could easily be hiding in a bush or in a tunnel down in the basement somewhere. I always just told myself they had absconded because they wanted to get away from the place, so why stick around? I had scared the jumpy records clerk, Rhonda, a number of times. During my patrols walking past her records room, she would see me out of the corner of her eye and jump, once even dropping the stack of papers she was holding and sending it flying into the air like a surprised cartoon character. She was pretty much the only one who worked on the lower level. I tried not to frighten her by startling her, but it was a bit of a running joke that she would jump whenever anyone passed by and said hello. The worst part of the basement to patrol was the really old section at the far west end away from everything. It was isolated, and there was really no reason for anyone to go down there. There was a small alcove at the end with a pair of heavy old wooden doors. You had to walk down a short 5-step staircase to get down to the alcove that looked like a lobby or waiting room for whatever was behind the doors. Whenever I would walk past the alcove, my spine would break into goosebumps. My whole body would tell me to get away. Our patrol check machine was at the top of the stairs, just outside this creepy little vestibule. The patrol check machine was essentially what it sounded like. It was a machine that you would scan a swipe card against during your rounds. This way, the company knew you were doing your job and walking around the hospital grounds doing your patrol, not just sitting in the office watching porno and reruns of The Office, as some night guards had been known to do. The patrol check machines were scattered all over the grounds, and twice per shift we had to visit all of them. It took about an hour and a half, depending on what you ran into during your route, to punch in at all of the machines. One pudgy old guard named Doug would just drive around in his car, hop out, and punch in at each machine, then drive to the next one. He did this while he was training me. He told me not to do this, since it's not allowed. I explored the hospital by myself when I started on my own, and discovered 95% of the hospital was unchecked during the strangely absent patrol routes. One day, when I went to go punch in at the patrol check machine, I thought I heard something from down the stairs, behind the doors. It sounded like a small child crying. I went down the stairs and looked at the door handles. A 2-inch thick chain was wrapped around them. The padlock was dusty, and the lock was laced with spider webs. I yanked on it briskly, but it was locked tight. My hands came away covered in gray dust and spider webs. No one had been in or out of the room for a very long time. I listened closely, thinking maybe it had just been old pipes creaking or an alarm chiming, something like that. I put my ear up to the thick wooden door. There it was again. The unmistakable sniffling sounds of a young child crying. It sounded like a little girl. Hello? I called through the door, timidly, frightened of what I might hear call back to me. Hello? Is someone there? Yes, I'm here. I'm a security guard for the hospital. Are you okay? How did you get in there? I don't know. She began to speak quickly and unintelligibly, before becoming understandable again. And lock the door. I can't see anything. It's so dark in here. I want my daddy. The child resumed sniffling and crying. I felt terrible for the little girl. Someone had probably come to visit a relative and left her alone, and she had wandered off to explore the mental hospital on her own. What kind of a parent could do something like that? Then I remembered we were in the middle of a pandemic, and there were no visitors allowed in the hospital to decrease the chance of an outbreak. She must have gotten in through a back tunnel somewhere, I thought. It was like the Clue mansion around this place. Hidden tunnels were just a matter of course. I seemed to find a different mysterious old section of the hospital every day, and side tunnels branched off in so many directions it was nearly impossible to explore them all. Some were so dark, dusty, and cobweb covered that it was obvious nobody had explored them for years. The place was so massive it seemed like there was no end to the ancient and unusual sections that were no longer used. especially down in the basement. People in town called the hospital the sanitarium, and its mysterious tunnels had been the source of local rumors and legends for years. I'm going to get you out of there, kid. Just hang on for a few minutes. Can you do that for me? I paused and waited for her to answer back. She didn't. Hey, my name's Jordan, I said, softening my tone. What's yours? There was no response for a few long moments. Then the voice answered back. Samantha, was all she would say. I looked at the key ring I had attached to my belt. It was the smallest ring, not the big one that had every conceivable key on it. This one had a copy of the GM, Grand Master Key, which opened basically every door on the premises, aside from a few seldom used ones. Padlocks were an exception. These were not often opened and locked off old, closed-off sections like this door where we were not expected to go on our rounds, so only the supervisor's ring held the keys for these locks. Behind these particular wooden doors was an old room which had once been used for electroshock therapy for pediatric patients way back in the old days. It had been closed up forever in the 1970s. Knowing I didn't have the right key for this lock, I pulled out my radio, then called in to the supervisor. Nothing came back. In the basement, the radio signal was terrible, and our old walkie-talkies had range issues. I have to go upstairs to get help, Samantha. You're being very brave right now. I'm going to go get your dad and the key for this door, and we're going to get you out of there. I waited for a few moments, but she wasn't going to say anything. Who knew how long she had been in there for? I bolted back up the hallway towards the staircase, pulling up my belt as I ran, the heavy keys and radio equipment jingling and rattling. I made it back to the main floor and called again on the radio for an answer. Hey, come in, Philip, I called over the radio, hailing for my supervisor. A few long moments went by, then I heard a crackle of static as his voice came back. Yeah, I'm here. I was about to tell him the situation when the PA beeped loudly overhead. A monotone airline pilot voice spoke clearly and distinctly, and with evident boredom. Code white, E as in Edward, 3. Code white, E, 3. Code white, E as in Edward, 3. There was a loud click as the PA shut off. Perfect timing, I thought to myself. Philip, can you hear me? There's a kid down in the basement locked in a room. I heard the code white. What do you want me to do? I checked my watch, jotting the time quickly in my notepad. 2:43 p.m. My shift ended at 3 p.m. These things always happen just before quitting time. Wow, okay. We need to deal with one thing at a time. Is she safe? I'm all the way at the other end of the property. I need you to respond to the cold white if you can. He didn't say what we were both thinking, that the only other security guard on duty was Doug, the disgruntled, overweight lifer who had trained me by driving me around the parking lot. He would not be a good person to rely on in an emergency. I'll just put it that way. His work ethic and motivation were questionable. I honestly don't know. Who knows how long the kid has been stuck in that room? It's the one in the basement down at the west end behind those giant wooden doors. Oh, wow. I could tell he knew the room I was talking about. There were a few guards who had bad feelings walking past it. I wasn't the only one. Okay, I'm going to run back. Just go to the code white and I'll head to the basement, Philip said. I put the walkie-talkie back in its holster and ran down the hall, opening doors too quickly and bolting through them. I had to run to the other end of the main building, so it took me a few minutes to get there. One nurse shook her head at me as I walked into the unit and immediately threw some heavy shade my way. "What are we even paying you guys for? We took care of it already." This particular nurse and I had never gotten along. She was an older RN named Mariana, who had worked there forever. She was the queen bee type, and during her shifts there was no doubt who was running the show. I walked further into the unit, ignoring her, and pulled out my notepad so that I could fill out my report before going home. I talked to a male nurse quickly, anxious to get back to the basement. It was weird. He was looking out the window and started freaking out, screaming, throwing his pudding at the wall. At least that's what the roommate said, and he's usually reliable enough. They pointed me in the direction of the roommate, Mike. I knew him from around the place. He was pleasant and kept to himself. He told me that he didn't see what had upset the other guy so much, but it was definitely something or someone outside that sent him into a frenzy. He had run away to get a nurse, and I told him he had done the right thing. With my notepad full of the requisite details, I hailed Philip on the radio again. "Hey, bud, you get her out of there yet? Guess it's gonna take a while to find the key, huh?" "There's no one down here. I got the door open a minute ago and the room's empty." I swore and ran downstairs, trying to figure out how he had gotten the location wrong. I hadn't given enough detail on the location. I got down to the basement and ran down the long corridor back to the west end. When I finally got there, I saw that he had gotten the location right after all. He was standing outside the room, dusting off his hands and looking at me. I left it open so you can take a look. No little girl. "You sure you heard it coming from this room? Not an air vent or something?" I told him I was sure, and that we needed to call the police. I double-checked with my flashlight inside the terrifying room. Most of the old equipment had been removed, so it stood bare and dusty. The few remaining pieces of unidentifiable hardware bolted to the walls were covered in cobwebs. The feeling of dread I felt like an aura around the room intensified the longer I looked inside. I couldn't bring myself to step inside. I know, I'm a coward. But Philip told me he had checked, and I knew he was reliable. He was a volunteer constable with the police department on his days off, waiting for a real position to open up, trying to get his foot in the door. I stepped back, unsure how this was possible. Maybe the child had gotten out the same way she had gotten in. We checked, and no one had come to the hospital with a child named Samantha that day. No children had been in the building at all. The police took a report and said they would cross-reference the case if any girls named Samantha were reported missing. But at the moment, there wasn't any open cases involving someone by that name in the area. We did a sweep of the basement and checked everywhere. I stayed 3 hours late, not caring if I would get paid for my time. The hospital was so large, it felt like we were searching for a needle in the haystack. Doug even surprised me by staying late and helping to search, although he didn't cover a lot of ground. By the time we were done, Philip was looking at me strangely. "You're sure you heard a little girl behind those doors?" The lock hadn't been touched for decades by the looks of it. I don't see how anyone could have gotten in there. I left work dejected, feeling like people had begun to think I was crazy. But I had heard the little girl down in that room. I was 100% sure of that. The police assured us they were going to follow up, but I couldn't help but think I was failing that little girl somehow. Where had she gone so suddenly? Greetings, spoils and ghouls. If you liked this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up. If you'd like to see more, subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss out. If you have a request or suggestion, make sure to leave them in the comment section below. We hope you enjoyed this video, and remember to stay spooky.